Well, it's wonderful to be with you this evening. My name is Logan, and if you're visiting with us for the first time, this is the third evening in a series of events that the Veritas Forum is putting on, the whole series aiming to look at this question, what is truth? To explore this question not just out of intellectual curiosity, but to examine it in light of deeper questions, perhaps we might say about human purpose, meaning, and perhaps even God. And the purpose of tonight's talk is to look particularly at this topic of tolerance. The title we have is True for You, but Not for Me, exploring truth, tolerance, and division. Now, I wonder if this has been mentioned in some of the other talks you've done this week, but each year there is a word of the year chosen by the Oxford English Dictionary. The year 2016 had the word post-truth as its word of the year. Now, they choose the word based on this criteria. The word is judged to reflect the ethos, mood, or preoccupations of that particular year, and to have lasting potential as a word of cultural significance. Post-truth was chosen and given the definition relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Now, I'll mention this word was chosen among such admirable finalists for the same competition as adulting, which was defined as the practice of behaving in a way characteristic of a responsible adult, as well as coulrophobia, which is the fear of clowns. But post-truth won it out, and they justified this decision on these grounds. While the concept of post-truth has been simmering for the past decade, we've seen this word spike in frequency this year in the context of the Brexit referendum in the UK and the presidential election in the States. Now, being American, I think it's easy to make fun of America, but I have a special right. I cherish that right to make fun of my own country, and I will. I think that it's no secret that in the American context, at least in part, this word in terms of its political significance, post-truth, has been applied to our president-elect to be inaugurated on Friday. And what's interesting, though, is, in the selection of the word post-truth as the Oxford word of the year to describe where our society is at, I think what that's actually saying is not necessarily that we don't care about truth. Because the reality is, when we apply this word to someone like Donald Trump, we might say, I wish Trump cared more about some of the truth. Here's a graph on climate data, just marking increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. We might say, I wish he cared more about that kind of truth. It was all appeals to emotion, but he set the truth aside. But in that sense, when we apply that adjective post-truth to Donald Trump, we don't mean it as a compliment. Ironically, the selection of this word as the word of the year, I think, reflects that there is something enduring about the concept of truth that we ideally would want in our political leaders, even if that's not ended up to be the case. But what I want to speak about this evening, in the context of this week, being put on by the Veritas organization, and personally me as a Christian, is to think about how do these concepts of truth relate to the idea of faith or believing in God. See, when we speak about truth in the context of maybe climate change, we're frustrated that Donald Trump isn't paying attention, perhaps. And we might say, in this case, Donald, it's not just true for me and not for you. You need to take this seriously, because this is scientific truth. And yet, when we turn to speak about the field of religion, what we find ourselves doing instead is very often speaking in terms of truths, or religious, this is a religious truth, but not the religious truth. We find this phrase used more often in the context of religion. It's true for you, but it's not true for me. And I think what we find there is introduced into this concept of truth, how we have different understandings of it. There's a kind of truth we might say is scientific, and we might speak of truth with that, with the word the truth. But when we speak of religion, now we're speaking of truths. And I want to begin this evening by looking into perhaps some of the intellectual history behind this distinction, that we have different understandings of truth as we apply it to different fields. Charles Taylor is a philosopher emeritus at McGill University in Montreal, and one of the massive books he manages to come out with every so often is called A Secular Age. And during this book, he spends a lot of time laying out intellectual history in the West in terms of how it's progressed in its thinking about secularism and the existence of God. And I just want to go through some of his insights because I think they're helpful for us tonight. He begins speaking about what he calls the sacramental understanding of reality that existed in the Middle Ages. And along this view, people saw that there was a physical reality, the world that they could touch and see and be a part of in a physical way, and yet they understood it as deeply penetrated by a spiritual reality that laid behind it. That the world, in a sense, was physical and yet deeply embedded with spiritual meaning. And as a reflection of this, you had very sacred places, shrines. People believed that there were particular ways that spirituality shone through the physical world in places as well as objects, relics, and a deep, sacramental understanding of spiritual realities lying behind the physical. And you'll notice here I've called the top level metaphysical, appealing really just to the simple understanding of meta being the Greek word for above or beyond, something that exists above or beyond the physical. But Taylor argues with the Reformation, a change of understanding occurred in the West. What you had was more of what you might call a stratified understanding of reality. Instead of believing that there were spiritual realities behind everything, the Reformers, Taylor argues, went back to what they saw as an early Christian or biblical understanding of, in fact, not so much of an enmeshed reality between the physical and the spiritual. That there was a time when God walked with Adam and Eve in the garden, that there was perhaps a time of intimacy and overlap in these two levels of reality, and yet through the corporate selfishness of Adam and Eve on behalf of the human race, a selfishness the Reformers would argue is something that all human beings continue to do. This created a break I've just symbolized by this line here, that led to, I think, what Taylor would describe as a spiritual ennui, a separation, a sense that even for someone who's a Christian, often God doesn't feel close. He feels far away. There's a sense that the spiritual world is a bit more distant than we might like. Taylor would point out that the Reformers would still emphasize that this gap has been bridged by revelation in the form of a holy scripture, but also through the incarnation. The Reformers had a strong idea that God actually came down from the metaphysical to the physical in the person of his Son to give his life as a payment for the punishment, payment for sin, in order to create a way for people to be reconciled to God by repentance and faith. However, in this context of the Enlightenment, of the Reformation, came the Enlightenment. And I really here want to point out that I think the modern understanding of truth, having a separate category for religious truth, comes from this man here, Immanuel Kant. Kant spoke into this stratified Reformation-era understanding of reality, but spoke about it just on the cusp of the scientific revolution. And Kant, you might know, is a philosopher who was very interested in the concepts of reason. And he essentially argued that, look, we have two levels of reality here. And Kant, I think, would have believed in some sort of God in the least. But he said, when it comes down to it, we really can only be sure about the things we can know from reason, the things we can observe empirically, the things that my senses can tell me and be understood by my mind. That's a kind of knowledge we can have that's concrete. He didn't totally deny the idea of the metaphysical, but he said, in a sense, the knowledge we can have that exists on that realm will be a different kind of knowledge. It's one that will be shadowed with a bit more of uncertainty, what philosophers sometimes call an apophatic reality, apophatic in the sense of shadowy. We can't really know for sure. What we might call an early agnosticism about really what the upper level of the building might look like. And in the aftermath of Kant, we had people like Friedrich Nietzsche begin to ask the question, well, perhaps we don't even need this upper story. And it was really Nietzsche who made big waves in the intellectual world to be claiming at that high level that perhaps God is dead. But I think that Kant's understanding really reflects where we are today. When it comes to religious truth, well, that's something we just can't really know for sure. We can know about scientific truth, but we're talking here about a different plane of reality. I think at the same time, the reason why, even though certainly there are many people who are atheists today, atheists all throughout time, I think that there's a reason why our society hasn't been able to completely on a social level, forget the upper floor or deny as a whole society that it exists, that it doesn't exist. And I think that's because there are certain metaphysical truths, what I'm going to call signals of transcendence, that continue to permeate even the values of modern society. And the first of those is humanistic. I'd forgotten that in the biography that I had given you all, I suppose, that I had mentioned the time I spent working in Nicaragua. I think we all, in our own life experience, have moments where we can point to and say, that was really a shaping moment on my life or my understanding of reality or what was really real. And for me, the time I spent working in Latin America had a big impact on me. One of the projects that I worked on was in the city dump in the city of Managua. There actually is a community that lives in that dump. They work sorting through the trash, finding things that are valuable, finding things that can be recycled and can be sold. And there actually is a school located within the bounds of the dump which serves the children in that community. And I was visiting there and was invited along by a teacher to try and grasp the extent to which child abuse was a problem in that community. And I remember being welcomed into the school and introduced to a young smiling boy, maybe 6 years old. And the teacher sort of pulled him aside and just showed me a bit on his shoulder where he had marks, deep red marks on his shoulder and down on his back that I learned were from a live electric wire that he'd been beaten with by his parents. And I think, having grown up in the West, I know that a lot of the world, this is not that... it's not that uncommon, and it is certainly also a problem in the West as well. But I think for me, it really was a shaping moment. I had in that 1 second just this deep sense of, oh my goodness, there is something deeply wrong here. There is something that has been violated that in some sense is sacred. And by that, I don't just mean mystical. I think I had a deep sense that apparently for these parents, this was permissible. It was all right to treat your child that way. You need to teach him a lesson. But I had something that went beyond just actually a sense of dignity conferred by a parent or conferred by society, I had this sense that even if all of society decided that kind of treatment of a child were okay, it still wouldn't be right. Even if the whole world decided that would be permissible. No, and there's something deeply wrong about that. And I think as many things that we feel deeply wrong about, those things often point us to things that are sacred and special, and I think that's where human dignity, I think, really struck me for the first time as something that I thought existed in a transcendental way. I think ours is the generation of social justice. I don't think there are many others. Millennials, we care about, human rights. That's our generation that we care about that, and I think that it's very challenging for atheism. It's challenging for a purely naturalistic worldview to give a basis for justification of the intrinsic value of human dignity. I think that's one of the reasons why we're not yet as a society shedding this upper floor of metaphysics. Sure, we might still feel uncertain about what exactly it looks like, but we still reach up to values like human dignity to speak about that. But I want to include now just a second one that I'm going to call the epic signal of transcendence. This here is a scene of Sauron's tower collapsing, and that is because I had another powerful experience watching a live performance of Return of the King. It was a screening at a concert hall with a live orchestra playing the music. And when the movie finally ended, it goes on a lot of endings, but probably the most powerful moment in the movie is when the ring is destroyed, Sauron's tower falls, the armies of Mordor flee. And as I was watching this movie, in that moment, the people around me, the crowds erupted in praise, literally clapping. I don't think it was just that this long movie had ended. There was something powerful about that moment in the story, good winning over evil, that I think resonated deeply, with everyone there. Maybe they were all just diehard Lord of the Rings fans. I think there was something deeper. I was reading an article in The Atlantic the other day written by a movie producer in Hollywood, certainly not a religious person, but him expressing his frustration that it seems all the movies we seem to be able to make have the same plot line. And he even was saying, those hipster movies that don't have happy endings? He says, the only reason that those strike you in that really, edgy way is because you still have in mind the original, normal paradigm for how stories usually go, good endings. What you learned in grade 3 of how every story has an introduction and then conflict, and then there's climax and a resolution. He just expressed this frustration at why is it we can only seem to tell one another these same stories. And I think, as with questions of human dignity, there is a sort of explanation of causality that can be offered. Well, I think there's explanations in our development, in our evolution, in our genes. But I think that there's something, certainly with the question of a humanistic value, that says, all right, well, that's an explanation of causality. That may be how that came about. And yet, many of us want to go further than that to say, well, just because it is that way, no, that's not an adequate justification for why it should be that way. I could look out at a forest in the field, across from the campus and say, well, that forest is there. But to then say, therefore, that it ought to be there and that it would be terrible to cut it down, even if you use the wood for good purposes, well, that's a logical leap. And then Hume spoke about this as Hume's fork, this idea that you can't go from an is to an ought, that it's one thing to have an explanation for why something exists in nature, but you can't logically go from there to say, therefore, it should be that way. In fact, if we did think that way, we could never be passionate about social justice. If we ever reasoned that the way things are, that's how they should be, well, then what justification would you have to change the status quo? And yet that's, I think, part of the human experience. And you might call me romantic for loving stories like Lord of the Rings. I think, as our MC was just telling me, she wrote doing her doctorate on C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis, very much a friend of J.R.R. Tolkien, was an atheist for a lot of his life. And it was actually a pivotal conversation with Tolkien on the idea of story that was it was a hinge moment in his journey, which was over a number of years in considering the Christian faith. And what Tolkien essentially proposed was this. He said, Lewis, you love myths, you love stories, you've built your academic career on this. Lewis was a professor of English. He said, you love them so much, and yet, don't you see that with the Christian faith, what you have here is just another myth? Another myth in the sense of a story that has good and evil and heroes and right and wrong and that sort of thing. The stories that you love. With one difference, perhaps, that it's actually true, that it really happened. And Lewis, as he reflected on this, put in his own words that he saw, on the one hand, a glib and shallow rationalism, the product of his atheism, which told him actually these values of good and evil and certain things of heroism or human dignity, they are ultimately very explainable and, in a sense, just like other physical realities like grass growing or mountains wearing down over time, that's just the way it is. He called that a glib and shallow rationalism. It drew out the wonder he found in the books that he loved. So he said on the one side, a glib and shallow rationalism, on the other side, a many-islanded sea. The stories that he loved to tell, the heroism, the epic nature of what he loves. And Tolkien essentially suggested, well, perhaps that's because behind all stories there is a transcendental story, a myth with the one difference that it actually happened, a myth that has at its center the person of Jesus Christ, the ultimate hero, who had the deepest moment of climax when it seemed no victory was possible, and yet was victorious over the grave. I think that our society still holds on to in the fact that we have art museums and we gather around and say, well, yes, certainly beauty is subjective to a degree, and yet there is something enduring about certain kinds of beauty where we say, no, there's something wonderful about that. We want to have a museum. We want to have an artistic display in our community. And I think I would say there is a sense in which we are appealing, therefore, we're reaching above the level of the physical and saying there is a reality that exists beyond that we value and build our societies around. I would say human rights and beauty in literature and art are signals that point to that. But I want to now acknowledge that, having acknowledged that the Kantian understanding is very powerful, well, there's a metaphysical world, but can we really know about that? I want to actually question whether we need to be asking good questions about what Kant proposed. And I want to structure this time thinking about what I'm going to call two questionable assumptions that Kant made, but two good intentions that I think most modern people have. The first questionable assumption I think I would suggest perhaps that Kant has made relates to the way he generalizes the metaphysical. Bernie Sanders, just a few months ago on the campaign trail, made the very popular comment that, when it comes to religion, all religions really have at their heart the golden rule. And what's interesting about this is, while certainly there is a lot of similarities between the religions of the world, one of my professors in the UK, Vince Vitale, who's a philosopher at Oxford, said, well, I think actually if what Bernie Sanders is referring to as the golden rule is what it tends to mean, which is the words of Jesus when he says, love your neighbor as yourself, if we actually do an honest assessment of other religions, probably the closest idea we get to that would be in the words of Confucius, who said, well, what we have is words that say, do not inflict on others which you would not like to have inflicted on yourself. And while certainly a similar principle, Vince Vitale argues that the difference perhaps is as great maybe as saying, well, you shouldn't punch your enemy in the face versus I'm going to build my enemy a hospital. And I think that we need to be wary, especially now speaking here in the context of the university, that we don't allow intellectual laziness to keep us from actually pressing into the dignity that and the history that each of the world religions have. I'll just point out as a last point on this that in general, statements that we make that are this wide sweeping, all of one thing are the same, in other disciplines we tend to avoid. Can you imagine someone proposing all Asian people are the same? Can you imagine the level of gross neglect of the individuality and richness of experience and life that each person would have in that group that you've just blatantly categorized in the same way? And I think, honestly, I don't know if I think it's not quite respectful of the world religions to look at them all and say all of this intellectual history, all of the literature, all of the art that these religions have produced, that all of them actually can be boiled down to one simple metaphysical reality that we can appeal to as a whole. But I want to move now to what I want to call the second questionable assumption, which is simply that all religions are equally valid, that if we have a certain amount of evidence for one religion, certainly there's evidence like that for all the others. And just as a humorous example, I'll just suggest, because we're speaking here in terms of religion very broadly, can you imagine, if we invented a religion surrounding the Loch Ness Monster? I have been to the UK, been to Scotland, I've seen the lochs, they are spooky and deep, and I think I would be open to the possibility that something of a monstrous type could live there. However, I think it would be intellectually perhaps lazy to say, well, the evidence of this, Photoshop disproved image of the Loch Ness Monster and perhaps a few sightings here and there is just as persuasive as evidence we find, I would suggest, in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, a historical figure, a figure who we have attestations of his death and resurrection from multiple sources from an early time period, attestations that have stood the scrutiny of 2,000 years. I would say, well, we might say, well, I'm a skeptical. I don't quite buy that Christian belief, but I still would say I think that we need to be intellectually rigorous to say, well, if we're speaking of religions broadly, I think we need to press in more deeply to the question of the validity of them and where the evidence actually lies. I would say those are two questionable assumptions that can be made, but I want to move now to two good intentions that I would want to affirm in the modern understanding of religion as pluralistic, truths but not truth. And the first of those would be the idea of inclusivity. You've perhaps seen this picture before of blind men trying to touch an elephant. Often this is used to describe a pluralistic understanding of religions. But if you haven't heard it, the illustration goes, here you have a bunch of blind men trying to describe what an elephant is like. You have one who's grabbing perhaps the leg of the elephant and describing the elephant as a tree. You have one who's putting his hands on the side of the elephant and saying an elephant is like a wall. And you have another still putting perhaps his hands on the trunk and saying, no, don't you see, an elephant is much more like a snake. And they're all trying to argue amongst one another and claiming that their perception of the elephant is in fact the only reality that's there. But the illustration concludes, don't you see, here you have people assuming that their experience of the elephant is the only experience there can be. But really, they all need to realize that they're interfacing just with this one larger reality. It would be inappropriate for any one of the men to say they have the whole picture, that they have a sense of what the whole elephant is like. And so the illustration goes, it's the same way with religions. Here you have the religions of the world trying to come up with objective descriptions of what this divine reality is like, what God is like, or what the metaphysical realm is like. And yet, don't you see, what's really going on here is you have all these different parties describing this one thing, and it's arrogant, it's narrow-minded. It's not reasonable for any one of them to claim they have the whole picture. But I think the question I would want to ask here is, from whose perspective is this illustration told? And it was Leslie Newbigin, who is a Christian philosopher, theologian, who lived in India for a number of years, who suggested this question to pose to this illustration. Who is this illustration told from? Presumably everyone in the illustration is blind. right? All of the men are blind. They're trying to describe what the elephant's like. But apparently, the person telling the illustration has his eyes open. They can see the whole picture. And I just think this is interesting. I want us to spend a moment reflecting on this, that the purpose of this illustration is to say there is no one take on spiritual reality that's better than any of the others. All takes on spirituality are equally valid because they're interfacing with this one reality that's there. But in a sense, in order to give this illustration, one has to assume a view of spiritual reality, that is, that all the religions are blind and touching this sort of elephant-like reality of God. One has to assume a view of spiritual reality and then say that actually this is the better view than all the others that I'm looking at. You see, the question is, we need to be wary of a Western bias that often says something like, all the religions in the world, of all across time, they've thought they've had the truth. But I, Western enlightened person, I can see what's really going on here, that all these religions are just interfacing with this one greater reality. I think what this points us to is the fact that actually when it comes to inclusivity, there's a desire that we should have for harmony, for social cohesion. But at the same time, what we find is that we all have exclusive religious beliefs. Even the view that says all religions are the same, all of them are touching this one reality, that certainly excludes any religion that claims it is the only way. That doesn't mean that it's wrong or incorrect. But in the same way, I think Andy Bannister spoke to you earlier this week, British accent. Someone could come and say, I have a British accent, but no, I don't. All of you have accents, I do not. Or similarly, the way that perhaps someone, a white suburban male, would say, I don't have any cultural bias, I think we would say it's not helpful for you to bring that into the conversation. In fact, we could have a much more frank conversation if you realize that actually we all are on equal playing field here. We have backgrounds and experiences and cultures that have shaped us into the people that we are. I think we need to be wary of doing the same thing with religions. But I want to move now to think about, I think we all have exclusive beliefs, but the real question is, how do our beliefs shape the way we treat one another? I think that is the key question, and it's here I want to turn to the topic of tolerance, which was in the title. Just by way of introduction on this, I think it's interesting that tolerance is one of these virtues that I don't think we would initially want on an individual level, and yet we want it on a social level. What do I mean by that? Take, for instance, the issue of the concept of justice. When I want justice for a society, I don't just want it for society. It's something that I would very much like to be a recipient of myself. But let's take the question of tolerance. Michael Ramsden, who's a British thinker, speaker, raised this illustration, which I find really helpful, but I'll contextualize for here. Imagine that after this meeting tonight, a few of you said, oh, Logan, I'd love to have you out for dinner. You know, I disagree with everything you say. I'd like to talk about that. And let's say that we go out for dinner, and we actually have a fine conversation. We have a wonderful time. The food is great, and you think, oh, it just went wonderfully. But then let's say the next day, I'm on campus, you see me across the room perhaps, you run up to me to say hello. Before you come to me, I'm having a conversation with someone. You sort of overhear what I'm saying, and they ask me, hey, I heard you had dinner with so-and-so last night. How was that? And I say, well, it was tolerable. And they go, oh, all right. Well, how's that? But how is he as a person? I've heard he's a wonderful guy. And I say, well, I can tolerate his presence. You know, you overhearing me in that situation, will you ever want to have dinner with me again? Will you ever invite me over for dinner? Certainly not. But why is that? And I think that's because when it comes to tolerance, none of us just want to be tolerated. Now, I don't want you to hear me wrong. I'm not saying we should have less than tolerance. I just think it's just interesting. Here you have a value that on the individual level, none of us really just want only to be tolerated. I think we want something more than that. There's a kind of tolerance today that says the most tolerant we can be is to virtually agree that everyone is right in your own way. If that's true for you, not just in religion, but in anything, then that's true ultimately. But I think, again, when the question is we all have exclusive beliefs, how do our exclusive beliefs lead us to treat one another? I think that actually tolerance sets the bar quite low in terms of really taking someone seriously as a human being, enhancing the view of the other. Because we could think about, if you really are respecting someone, that means you're going to take what they say seriously. If you're just tolerating them and you don't really care what they believe, well, is that really taking with real weight what that person is saying? I think that's why the good intention of tolerance, I think, actually has behind it these deeper values of respect and love. And I want to latch onto this question of love now. Love, I think, in our culture is seen as diametrically opposed to truth. And I think the reasoning is this. We look at truth and we say truth, by definition, leads to division. The moment you stand up and say, this is the way things are, you're going to create people who either disagree with that or people who feel excluded by that. And because of that, suddenly you have created another. There's a barrier here. You are in one group, someone else is in the other. And as we saw with the Nuremberg trials, we saw with Eichmann, what happens in the worst kind of dehumanization, the dehumanization of genocide, is essentially that someone has become another. And through the reinforcing act of violence, sociologists tell us that the other is stripped of their human value and given the value of an object. And so I think that in our modern culture today, truth is something, especially in the area of religion, we're wary of. It creates division. And I think when we speak about love then in this context, I think it's almost the case that we really would rather be wrong than be seen as intolerant. We put truth above the value, we love above the value of truth. I want to suggest that this is not the only way those two terms can be synthesized. And I hope that you've come out tonight thinking about this topic of tolerance in the context of the division, certainly division in my country, in the States. I think the division that's shaping a lot of the Western world. How are we going to move forward? As Os Guinness, the social critic, writes, when now we live together with our deepest differences. How can you live together in one society with our deepest differences? I think the level of tolerance doesn't have the degree of respect we can have that really takes someone serious, takes what they believe serious, perhaps even believe serious enough to disagree. I think there's a kind of synthesis that we need to draw back to of love and truth that Martin Luther King modeled well. Just yesterday was Martin Luther King Day in the States. And King was not just a social activist. I don't think that's the main part of his legacy. Certainly he was one. But he was a social activist that pioneered a particular kind of activism that was based in the principle of nonviolence. Here's what he says in his own words. Through nonviolent resistance, we shall be able to oppose the unjust system and at the same time love the perpetrators of that system. And I think of anyone in the 20th century, King was someone who stood on truth, the conviction of truth that actually all human beings are created equal, that there is racial injustice going on in this country, and that something needs to be done about that. That's a very confrontational statement of truth, and it got him a lot of enemies. And yet in the second part of this statement, I think we see the key to the nonviolent movement within civil rights, which was that actually there's a degree of love going on alongside the truth. And certainly I want to be first to say that the United States has not overcome its racial problems. But I think that something pivotal did happen in the 1960s, when you had people carrying around signs that said, I am a man, and you saw these people moments later attacked by police dogs or sprayed down by fire hoses. I think when we saw things like the confrontation at Selma, peaceful protesters walking across a bridge being brutally attacked by police, and I think this is perhaps one of the most powerful images. Here you have one of the sit-ins in the South where people sat in cafes and restaurants in segregated areas and had drinks literally poured over their heads in the process. And I think the reason why King was able to win over what we might call white America, not in its totality, but certainly in a large part of it, was through this kind of a stance for truth. And I would say it's this kind of a stance for truth that was based on love. It was a truth that didn't just settle for being right. He knew he was right. But it was a truth that said, I want more than that. I desire a society built around justice. I don't want to just impose that. I want people to see the beauty of what was here. And I think just as a diagram, what we see was that introduced into the equation by the nonviolent civil rights movement was the interruption of truth to division with love. Love that suffered on the part of those who were divided from the truth. And just now, as we close, start to draw our time to a close, I do want to think about the other part of Martin Luther King's life. King, as you might know, probably know, was a pastor. And he was very upfront in his sermons on nonviolence, that his methodology for confronting truth with love and saying, actually, do we really need to choose between the two, was grounded in the understanding he had of the Christian God. And just as an illustration of this, I want to share with you a passage of Scripture that I find particularly provocative and helpful, thinking about the concepts of truth and love in the Christian faith. You might know this scene. It's a depiction of Jesus as he stands before Pontius Pilate on trial. And in the moments before this scene, we're told in the Gospel of Matthew that the following conversation took place. We have Pilate saying to Jesus, "So you are a king?" Jesus is answering, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asks him, "What is truth?" Truth, 2,000 years ago, at the center of the focus. Jesus doesn't answer this question, by the way, in the Gospel of Matthew. A few chapters earlier, we have Jesus saying in the Gospel of John, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." So here you have Jesus claiming to be truth. Certainly he stood for a kind of truth that got him a lot of enemies, a truth that confronted. But I think the resolution of the kind of truth Jesus was, perhaps why even Jesus didn't want to put into terms again the kind of truth he was right here before Pilate, was because I think it was a truth demonstrated in deeds. And I think here is where King finds the method of nonviolence. Because I think we need to see that right after this happens, this trial of Jesus in front of the public, you also have the character of Barabbas introduced into the story. Now, you might notice that Barabbas, between the four Gospels, he's included in all of them, all of the biographical accounts of Jesus. He's described in various places as a murderer, as an insurrectionist, as a thief. And I want to just point out two interesting parallels between Jesus and the character of Barabbas. One, interestingly, is that it seems that both of them had the same name. In some of the earliest manuscripts we've had, we actually find that it's Jesus Barabbas was his full name. So here, it's interesting. You have two Jesuses. Also interesting that both of them are accused of the same crime. Barabbas was probably an insurrectionist. There was a zealot. There were many messianic movements in this time in first century Judaism. This also is the charge that's laid against Jesus. You have a claim of authority. The Jews, the Romans continued to see this, as with Paul and the other early Christians, as internal religious disputes. The way that the Jews were able to elevate the stakes on this was to make accusations, as we saw Pilate discussing with Jesus, about being a king, a kind of higher king than Caesar. And what's interesting between these two characters is in this very painting, both characters are probably near one another. Jesus here, but also scholars suggest this probably took place in the Roman Praetorium, which means that Barabbas' cell was probably just in another part of this building. And what's interesting to think about this is how much Barabbas might have been aware of what was going on up here, up front, in front of the crowds. And there's an interesting suggestion, a theory, and I think it's certainly just speculative, but it's interesting, that perhaps Barabbas, if he could have heard anything, would have heard what the crowd was saying, but probably not the words between Jesus and Caesar. In Matthew's gospel, the crowd only says two things. Verse 21, the governor again said to them, offering to the crowd, "Which of these two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said, "Let him be crucified." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." It's a common passage we read around Easter time. But what's interesting here is that if we were to put ourselves in the place of Barabbas, what we hear first is the crowd shouting, "Barabbas." Imagine Barabbas in the cell. Here's his name. Ears perk up. The next thing he hears is, "Let him be crucified." And again, I acknowledge that this is speculative. However, I think the editor of this gospel, editor Matthew, is intentional with the pieces he puts together here. And I want us to imagine the scene. Again, going back to the scene here, that this is all happening live time. Someone comes to Barabbas' cell, and he's thinking, all right, maybe he's been in prison for a time, who knows? But it's his day, here we go. And let's say the prison guard comes, gruffly opens the door, and says, all right, you may go free. Barabbas says, what's going on? And we just might imagine that perhaps what would happen is that the guard would point out the window, and Barabbas would see Jesus of Nazareth being walked away, carrying the cross, going up to Golgotha to be crucified. And I think what's interesting about this, and certainly intentional on part of Matthew, the author, is he's suggesting what's happening here with Barabbas is reflected in the larger Christian reality of the New Testament, which is what is offered by Jesus here. Barabbas would be the only person historically who could say, Jesus died in his place. He could look out at Jesus saying, that cross that he's carrying is literally my cross. The nails that are going into his hands are literally my nails. And similarly, the free air that I'm now breathing was his. The life that now I'm free to live was his to give. But I want to just conclude with a couple more thoughts I think we get from this character. Barabbas' name in the Hebrew comes from the prefix bar and abba, the second aspect, the second part. Bar, which means son of, like a bar mitzvah. Abba, and if you perhaps grown up in the church, you might know that Abba is the word that Jesus often used to speak of God. Now, nowadays we often are familiar with calling ourselves God's children and thinking of ourselves that way, but we need to realize that for most of first century Judaism, this was not common. It was weird that Jesus called God Abba. Often people didn't like it and found it disrespectful, because Abba isn't even the word for just father in the Hebrew. It's the word that's more intimate, the word that a child would use of speaking of daddy or that sort of thing. And we have to keep in mind, this is the God of the Old Testament. This is the God who, when he came down on a mountain, you touch the mountain and you might get fried. This is the God who, when Moses looks at his backside, has such a transfigured experience that his face is so distressing, he has to carry a towel over it to not upset people. No one calls this God Abba. Jesus does. Jesus does throughout his whole life, except at one place. Jesus, a few chapters later, gives the address in Matthew 27, my God, why have you forsaken me?" while he's on the cross. And here the word is Eloi, it's the more distant, my God. It's not the intimate language he had before. And I think we need to give these first century authors credit. I think Matthew is suggesting something here very provocative, that Jesus here is not just offering this sort of, freedom, I'm taking your punishment for you. I think what's actually offered is a positive component as well. I think that the truth of Jesus is said to confront, but what's offered on the positive side is an incorporation into the family of God. This is the language of adoption that theologians use, that on the cross you have Jesus taking on the distance from God that perhaps Barabbas deserved, in order that Barabbas might be the son of the Father that Jesus really was. I think that Martin Luther King found inspiration in this model, a stance for truth. We have transcendent realities that we're passionate about today. Human rights would certainly be one of those. And a truth that's so beautiful that division perhaps could be worth it. But how in our divided culture do we meet the division that separates us? People of the same faith, people of different faiths, people of no faith. And I think that's where the model of the cross, I think, proposes a compelling antidote to the spiral that goes down to devaluation and dehumanization. It arrests, I think, the tendency of our hearts, once we've created the other, to look down on them. And I think when it comes down to then the view of the other and the view of the self, if we all have exclusive beliefs, and the real question is, how do our beliefs lead us to treat other people? I want to end with two challenges. First, a challenge to the Christian. Maybe you're here and you are a Christian. I think that the challenge for us who are Christians is to live in light of what this says about our view of ourselves. Often when we think of religion, we might say, it's okay to be a little religious, but don't be too religious. Don't be one of those intolerant Christians going out and converting people or that sort of thing. We think that it's okay to be religious in small doses, but don't take it too seriously. And I think because of that, we see that there's a certain degree of arrogance that can grow. But I think what's interesting about this is if the center of the Christian faith is this idea that, all right, you're right with God based on nothing that you've done, but because you're such a broken, messed up person, Christianity has nothing to offer unless you see yourself as a sinner. Nothing to offer. But for the one who does, here it offers forgiveness, embrace into God's family. If you really, truly believe that, and someone is a Christian and say, I believe that, and yet you see a deep arrogance in their life, it's not really a question of being too Christian, but not Christian enough, if this is the foundation of what it means to be a Christian, that you're right by God as a gift, as Paul says, by grace through faith. Paul speaks in the book of Galatians that when you bite a Christian, it should taste like a certain kind of fruit: love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, faithfulness, self-control. I wonder if in the West, certainly it's the case in America, I wonder if it's the case in Canada, if Christians are known for this kind of radical love, that's not just a love in spirit, but a kind of love that suffers for the sake of truth. I think that's the challenge we face as Christians. I think if you're here and you're not a Christian, it might be that you say, I disagree with everything you've shared. I think that's wonderful. We'll have a time of Q&A, and I'd love to hear from you. But I think the question I want to ask is, Do you have a basis for the sacredness of human dignity? Do you have a basis for the view of the other that goes beyond just, don't harm anybody, I have these arbitrary restrictions, just don't be too crazy, but one that actually humanizes the other to the point of saying, I see you not just as a sack of molecules in the shape of a human being. Just as I had a baby carrot this morning, molecules in the shape of a carrot, didn't feel bad about it. What makes a human being have that value that gives us, I'd say, the imperative to have a culture based on equal rights and dignity? And I say that not in a way of pushing or poking, but really to say I think that we can. I think that there are metaphysical truths that even I think we breathe in if you say, I'm not religious, but I think that we appeal to. I hope that you think about for yourselves, I think what is offered here in terms of a basis for understanding, both I think for the humble view of the self and a humanistic, humanized view of the other. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Logan. Your computer is on top of my notes. All right. So yeah, that was awesome. Another round of applause. Okay, so now it's time for the Q&A session. So what I would ask you to do is if you have a question, you can either come up here to that microphone right there, or you can text your question in. If you don't want to come up and ask, just text it to the phone number over there, 905-317-7176. I will get it, and I can moderate. All right. I'm on top of your notes.
All right. Guess no dinner invitations tonight to argue. That's great.
Okay. First question. Okay. People accuse Christianity of being too anthropogenic-centered. Can you comment on that?
Too anthropogenic-centered. So I suppose that's suggesting that, look, human beings are one part of the created order. Is this an over-obsession on the human race that leads to the sort of denigration of the other parts of creation that we have? Would that be a valid summary of that question? Do you think that's what it's saying, more or less?
I think so.
Yeah, I think, okay.
I think one of the...
Go ahead.
Yeah, this one mic thing is tough. I know one of the things that I've sort of often faced on both sides of the debate is the idea that for Christians, we are created in the image of God, and then there's the critique that God is perhaps created in our image. And I think that plays into this sort of anthropogenic image as well, that it's really sort of human-centered. And we can take it both ways. We can take it, I think, like what you said, but also the idea that we're just sort of taking ourselves and projecting it onto the divine.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think certainly in the last 100 years we've had people like Freud suggesting that our conceptions of God really are rooted in our psychology, or others who would say, well, this is really at its heart just an evolutionary reaction to needing to cope with the hard realities of life that's developed over time, and perhaps this is just wishful thinking, and I think that's a fair critique that a Christian needs to think about and answer. I think often there's a conception of faith where, well, this is just something you need to believe. It's a tradition, perhaps it's something you've grown up with, or it's something that's been taught by the church, and so you need to just submit to that, and that's just how God is. But I think that actually As Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think for the Christian as well, the Christian needs to be ready, Peter writes, always to be ready to give an answer when people ask for a reason for the hope that is in us. And I think what Peter is suggesting as he's saying that is that the Christian faith speaks to both reason and to hope. We might say that, as C.S. Lewis said, Christianity has some nice ideas. You could just say it's pie in the sky. But this still leaves the question whether or not the pie in the sky is really there. And I think that the Christian understanding of God is rooted, I would say, in evidence that comes from the realm of the philosophical, the realm of the historical, and I think the realm of the existential. I think that if I were to ask why do I believe in the Christian conception of God, I would give an answer along those three lines. And perhaps it would be most helpful maybe to comment on this idea of, I suppose perhaps on the idea of history. For Christians especially, we develop our understanding of God from these revealed texts over time. And I think we might say, well, there are lots of religious texts in the world, why would you take the Christian ones so seriously? And I think that that's where I've included Jesus in this story, not just because I'm a Christian and all Christians want to do is talk about Jesus, but because I do think that the Christian idea of the incarnation, I think, is very unique. It's unique because you have here, when the Russians went to space and in the 1950s, you had some of the first cosmonauts coming back and saying, we've gone to space and found no God. And C.S. Lewis at the time commented, well, isn't that a little bit foolish way of thinking about how God works? It's sort of like saying we were at a play watching Shakespeare and we couldn't find Shakespeare in the rafters, therefore he doesn't exist. That actually the way that God relates to the world might be more like that of an author in a story. And what is suggested in that doctrine of incarnation is that God himself became a human being, that is why, in some sense, the idea that God is human-like in a Christian understanding is very much affirmed by this idea of God becoming a human being. That, in fact, actually happened, Christians believed. But I think that remains a nice idea and a good, pretty philosophy before I think we start moving into the realm of history. As I mentioned, I think that it's worth, if you've never looked into the claims of the Bible, claims of the life of Jesus, really to see for yourself and make up your own mind. What we have with Jesus is a figure who virtually no credible historian and an academic post today would deny existed. You even have someone like Bart Ehrman, very much a skeptic of the New Testament, saying it's really beyond debate whether this man existed or not. And I think the evidence is compelling that something very interesting happened surrounding the resurrection. For a Christian, this is central. Paul says if the resurrection didn't happen, no use being a Christian. And I think that if indeed Jesus was who he says he was, if he really rose from the dead, that would bring legitimacy to the claims he made about himself, and claims which I would say, if we do justice with the text, are very overtly claims of divinity at numerous places throughout his whole life. And I think that if indeed his raising from the dead, something he said he would do, if that really happened, if the evidence is really there, I think that we need to take seriously that this man was who he says he was, as scary as that might be, or whatever the implications that might be. So in terms of God being human-like, I think I would want to say, well, that's possible. It certainly is possible that could be just an evolutionary byproduct or a psychological hallucination. But I think that, one, we need to deal with the claims of history and really deal seriously with if this really happened, that would change everything. But two, I would say, the challenge with those critiques is that they can always be turned back on themselves. Take, for instance, this idea that, it's been said, Christianity is for those who are afraid of the light. I think that, Jesus, when he speaks of afraid of the dark, Jesus says, come and follow me, pick up my cross. I don't think that's as rosy an image, actually, as we think of the Christian faith. Jesus says, following me is going to feel like I'm killing you sometimes. I don't think it's quite that rosy, but we could equally launch the critique back and say, perhaps someone's atheism is a fear of the light, a desire, in fact, what the Bible would say, we all actually naturally have for autonomy, a desire for not having to live a life that God is going to ask everything of us and not necessarily give us back anything except himself. And I think that critique cuts both ways. It might be that the desire for atheism, for there to be no God, could be subject to, well, perhaps that's a psychological reaction you have, or perhaps that can find itself in evolutionary tendencies. I think those are interesting questions to ask, but I don't think they quite get to the heart of truth, which I would say is based more on the evidence. And I think the evidence of God becoming a human being lies in the question of the resurrection, the question of the historical Jesus. So that's what I'd say as a start to that answer.
I'm going to ask the rest of the questions from here.
Sure.
Okay, so I think you basically answered this one already with what you said about history and the historical Jesus, but I'm going to ask it just in case you have more to say. So this question, why should we consider metaphysical absolutes, such as the exclusive truth of a religious faith, when these ideas cannot be empirically tested?
Yes, I think that the first part of what I'd say to that is actually I do think we all have exclusive religious beliefs. I think even the belief that says all religions are the same or there is no religion, both of those are exclusive beliefs. I think that perhaps an agnosticism is as close as you could get to a fully inclusive view, but I would still say that is a view. That's a view that says we cannot know. And so in that sense, I think, one, we all have exclusive beliefs. It really does come down to which one are we going to choose. And I think that all of us want to believe what's really true. Could you remind me the words of the second part of the question?
Well, the question was why we should consider these metaphysical absolutes when they can't be empirically tested.
Yes, I think I would say, I would sort of contend with the language there, and I think I'd say, in some sense, we have an ability to empirically look at some realities related to the Christian metaphysic. You might say, maybe you don't like this sort of an answer, but it might be even that the testimony, of a Christian friend, maybe a friend who brought you here, of God working in their life and changing them into a different kind of person. I think that actually, in even a crude sense, is a bit like the scientific experimentation of, does this really make a difference? The Christian faith claims to change people. Do we see evidence of that? I think in a sense that can be verified by the life experience that Christians have. But I know that that's not really what this person is asking. And I think because of that, I do want to say, a bit more. I think, and my graduate work was in theology and philosophy, and I would recommend to you someone a bit more qualified in the area that I'm about to speak about. Someone like John Lennox, perhaps, who's a mathematics and professor at the University of Oxford, but has also done a lot of work on the relationship between science and faith and that sort of thing. But I think that actually the confidence we can have in the reliability of our empirical data assumes a confidence that needs to be found in the human ability to rationalize accurately about the world. It was Einstein, who certainly wasn't a Christian and hard to really know what he believed about God, who said the only thing incomprehensible about the universe is that it is comprehensible. And I think what he was getting at is this: if the human brain is only, not to say, if it's only just the product of what Richard Dawkins calls blind, pitiless indifference, driven through the processes of natural selection to survive, that's not necessarily an adequate basis for us to trust the mind's ability to tell us what's true. We might say, well, knowing truth helps us to survive. And I think we'd say, well, that is an assumption. When I've lived in Central America, often a lot of the corruption that you see in certain government levels, I think we have it in our own governments in the West, but sometimes when the stakes are higher, when it's harder, when there's less resources around, often that's where survival's at stake, and often I think that's where truth has a tendency to be bent. And I think when we think about this in terms of science, I actually think that our trust in scientific rationalism and its ability to tell us what's really real in the world, that assumes, it puts a huge confidence in the ability of reason to work. And I think that the Christian faith offers a more robust grounding for why we can trust our rationality, not just that we're products of evolution, perhaps, but that we're products that also, through that process, have been guided in a way by God to be able to discern and know what's true. So I think that I would say our reliance on empiricism requires a very deep trust in the mind. And I would say, on what basis are we placing that trust? But I commend to you a philosopher in that area, John Lennox, book written, God's Undertaker, which explores that issue more deeply.
Right,
Thanks.
excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I've got two questions about religious truth. And both are along the lines of, if there's religious truth rather than religious truths, how do you determine what that religious truth is? How do you determine if one religion is more true than the other?
Yes, and I think it can feel almost overwhelming sometimes when there's so many religions out there. And how could you possibly even choose one? Certainly perhaps if you haven't tried all the other options. But I think the first part of thinking through this question is thinking about actually most religions do fall into a few distinct categories. You certainly have the monotheistic family, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, perhaps some smaller other ones in that category. You have the pantheistic religions, which often are said to encompass Hinduism, Buddhism in a sense, that Buddhism doesn't quite have a conception of God in the theistic sense. Pantheism, which would hold that actually God exists not external from reality, but within it, that there is a sense in which Atman is Brahman, that actually God's reality permeates everything, a bit more like that sacramental understanding, except that God is actually, he's there, he's in the wood as much as he's in you and me. And I think then you have, perhaps as another category, atheism as a religious belief. I think that you also might have animism and smaller beliefs in that sort of category as well. So I think that actually it is helpful to realize that there are different, we're not working with too many options here in terms of large metaphysical systems. But I think that there are three questions that I think we can sort of ask to determine which of those, how do we start then deciphering through these sorts of questions. I think that one is empirical reality or empirical history. I think that we do need to look at the claims of things like history to really see if it's valid empirically. So take, for instance, the death of Jesus. One of the reasons why I'm not a Muslim is because I really wrestle to believe the Quran makes this statement a number of times that Jesus actually didn't die. Now, I wasn't there. I can't know for sure. But the reality is that the Quran is a 6th century document in terms of when it was at least written down in the Muslim understanding. We have sources from Greeks, Romans, Jews, Christians, non-Christians, people of other faiths, from as early as the 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, all claiming that Jesus actually died on the cross. So I think from a historical perspective, I'd say, you're right, they might have all gotten it wrong. That's possible. I want to be humble and admit that. But at the same time, I think when we're going to be fair about the empirical truth that comes to us from history, I think we need to take that seriously. I'd want to say, show me the evidence for that, and I'm open to being persuaded. I think that the next, in addition to empirical reality, I think we should think about internal consistency. One of the questions I would have for my friends who belong to a pantheistic world system is, I feel that you lose some of the sharpness we want to have about some of the values of transcendent goodness and evil. And I think that, you might say, well, I don't believe in those things, or I think that it's more relative than you're saying. But I think, having worked in a place where really, I think human rights is really front and center, this story I told you in Nicaragua, I think I am very convinced that if religion is all about theories scientifically almost to try and describe the reality we experience, I do think we live in a moral universe. And I think I want to say that these aren't just biological programming. I think I want to say, no, there's something more to it. It might seem, Richard Dawkins sometimes suggests our biological programming tells us that we should perhaps not have special needs children as part of our society because of the drain of resources they take. And I say, oh my goodness, if our biology does tell us that, I want to break the rule right then and there. I think there are some transcendent truths that we want to value. I feel in this idea that everything is one, that in a sense, taking a step back, I feel at the high levels good and evil become too conflated for my liking. But I think the last category I think about is existential relevance. I do think that that's another category on which we determine truth. There are a lot of facts in mathematics that are true but don't make a difference in my life. And that's where I do think this idea of what God offers in terms of a personal relationship, a love that can change you, just like the love of Martin Luther King changed a generation in the States. I think that that's something to take seriously as well. So I would say those three, knowing the categories but then also knowing the right questions to ask, that's what I would suggest.
Well, this sort of hinges off your talk of Nicaragua. I can't even say that now. Nicaragua. When dehumanization happens with some of the tragic things in the world, how do we as a society make our way back to a position of love or truth?
Yes. When dehumanization happens on the level of society, how do we make our way back to love and truth? I think this really comes down to how we see one another and how we see ourselves. Henry Tajfel was a Polish psychologist, sociologist. He lived in the 1970s, and it was he who pioneered a field called group identity theory. And he looked at things like, what happens when you divide people into groups, even arbitrarily? He flipped coins with boys in a high school in Southern California and just put people randomly in groups, and then looked at how they treated one another in terms of they had certain amounts of money they could allocate to people within their group and other groups. And they saw, even though the designation was totally arbitrary between those groups, that the moment you created an in-group, out-group differentiation, you had sense of superiority, you had preferential treatment for the in-group. And I think the reality is we live in a society that's diverse. And I think that the danger of something like tolerance to downplay that diversity and say, actually, it's all the same. In other areas, as I said about all Asians being the same or we're all colorblind, I think that's not actually helpful. That actually there's something about our diversity that leads us into a more humane society. And so I think I would say that somehow we need to overcome this almost biological trajectory that each of us have to look down on people who are different from us. And I think that comes down to how we view the other and how we view the self, as I've said. And I think, to use Tajfel's own language, I think what Christianity offers uniquely is a basis for in-group differentiation that's on humility. That's actually, the only reason I'm a Christian is not because I'm a better person than you at all. There are people who are atheists who are far better than many Christians, and definitely better than me. And yet, I think that if a worldview or psychology is based on achieving, I want to be a good person, or I want to earn my way to God. There's a theistic and a non-theistic way to phrase that, as noble as that can sound, and you can live a great life that way. I think the danger is that it leads us into looking down on people who haven't achieved as much as us. And that's where I do find you need to incorporate into society a view of the self that's humble, that's not going to look down on others, an in-grouping that creates that kind of feeling, as well, though, as a humanizing view of the other. How much is something worth in economic theory? How much are you willing to pay for it? I think this is where the Christian faith offers God paying himself the greatest infinite value for another person. I think that humanizes the other. I think that truth and love are values that we still care about today. I think we need to hold them together. And I think that there's a way to do that. I think there's a way humbly. But I think it comes down to how we see ourselves and how we see the other.
All right. Yeah. Okay, so another question. Is the church today too tolerant or not tolerant enough?
I really wrestle with this word tolerant because I don't think it's quite the best adjective. I don't think it's a wonderful ideal for the church even to have. But I do think that, as I mentioned in my talk, I think as Christians, if you're a Christian here, I think that we have lost. I think that our stances for truth have sometimes come at the expense of a love that we should feel for those we disagree with. And I think part of that comes through, I think in a way, the luxury we Christians have enjoyed in the culture, and actually perhaps the lack of persecution we've endured in the last 1,000 years just have made it such that we can become so complicit with power. It's so interesting that Jesus, when he speaks of himself as a king, he's very clear to say, I'm not a political king. That in a way that Jesus came, Christians believe, to create a kind of community, but a kind of community that would not be focused around a kingdom on the earthly scale. I think that's certainly the case in my country, is that I think Christians have had an ideal that what matters most is that Christian principles be imposed on the society. If only we could have that, then that would solve the problem. And I think that there is a sense in which if Christians really believe that God's word is good, then they would naturally, rightfully want to believe that that's a good value to be lived out. But I think at the same time, there are a lot of wonderful moral people that Jesus had big problems with. The Pharisees, the religious leaders, who were as good people as you can ever have. But I think that Jesus' qualm with them was actually, if your understanding of faith is purely moralistic, then that's not actually the kind of faith I think that God wants, and I think it's the kind of faith that smells of superiority that is so deeply off-putting. I think that there's a non-religious way of being superior, of saying the problem with the world is all the religious people, but there's a religious way of being superior that says the problem with the world is all those non-religious people. I think that the Christian answer is the problem is all of us. The problem is within. As Solzhenitsyn said, the line between good and evil, we wish it went through national borders, but it goes within the human heart. And I think this is where Jesus' diagnosis of the human situation is compelling. And I think that what Jesus was always interested in was not, primarily moral. I think, say, someone who feels judged by a certain Christian position, I would say, well, Yes, there are parts of the Bible that modern people don't like today. That's certainly true. But I think that the Bible doesn't have just certain parts of it written to certain people of a certain sin, and other parts for other people of a certain sin. Actually, the message of the Bible is the same for all of us. It's this message that is one of that we all have disordered desires, disordered loves, as the theologian Augustine said. It's that we have loves, but we put them in the wrong order. That we have a separation from God, but that God loves us, that God loves each and every one of us, loves us even in our brokenness. And I think that there is no one here who God doesn't love. I would say that. But I think that the real that dynamic, what Christianity is interested in, is not live this good moral life, but where do you stand with God? Do you know that you're loved by Him? Have you stepped into that relationship? Do you know what's on offer here? We don't know the end of the story with Barabbas. We never hear of him. He's never even written about in Christian antiquity. But I do think that being able to look, and if he really saw what had been done for him, it's the kind of love that is hard not to respond to. And I think that's the invitation the Christian faith offers. How do you respond to the love that's so lavishly shown? Maybe it's pie in the sky. But I want to know then whether or not it exists. I think the Christian faith, if you say, I just don't believe that, I would say, well, I hope that you would like to believe it. It might just be a fantasy, but I think it's a very powerful, compelling thing that many of us, I think even if you're not a Christian, is worth looking into because of what's on offer.
Okay, great. All right, one more question. What happens when a non-Christian asks about hell? How do we respond with truth and love?
Yeah, great. Saving the easy ones for last. Love it. I think that part of the challenge of the question of hell is that it's been divorced more from Scripture and been incorporated more into a medieval, almost artistic understanding of hell being people with pointy forks and hats and that sort of thing, which I don't think is quite present in Scripture. Hell certainly is spoken of in the Bible as a fearful place, but really in the Christian understanding, what makes heaven heaven and hell hell is the presence and the absence of God. And I think that therefore, when we think about the doctrine of hell in Christianity, I think we need to look at it through the lens of justice and the lens of mercy. I do think that all of us, most people, have a sense of justice. Sure, there are slight subjectivities perhaps in each one of our senses of justice, but on the whole, for many major issues, say human rights, we have a sense of justice. And I think that means we're faced with the troubling reality that there are many people who will do awful things in this life and completely get away with it. People who murder people who, go and abuse, just like in that story, and they will never face penalty in the law, or maybe they'll live a great, wonderful life, and they'll never face any consequences. And I think that there's something in us, one, that initially reacts to that and says, ugh, there's a deep injustice going on there if there's no accounting of justice. And I think that actually, when we think about the idea of hell as actually justice, it doesn't solve the question, but at least gets us thinking about, well, there is something in us that wants justice. And I think this is where it ties in so closely to love, because those two concepts, I think, are closer than we tend to admit. If a parent loves a child, and then the child gets beat up or totally mistreated, and the parent says, oh, that's totally okay, I'm not gonna say anything about it, they probably, they don't do anything, we'd say, is there real love there? That actually a love for that child would lead to a desire for justice, or a value for justice, and that's what the God of the Bible is described like. But I do think there's something deeper about love in the sense that love freely has to be chosen. I'm an American, let's imagine I have a gun in my pocket. I bring up one of you on stage and I say, I love you so much, do you love me? I hold a gun to your head. You might say, yes, of course I love you, but we'd say that's probably not true love happening right there, because why? Because it's forced, it's compelled. And I think in the same way what that means is that for love to be genuine, and the God of the Bible seems to want that kind of intimate love with us, it needs to be a love that's freely chosen. And I think that's where, when we think about the idea of hell, not just as pointy people hopping around in the fire, but as a fearful place, fearful because of the absence of God, then I think that's where we find, as C.S. Lewis said, God, I think, allows us the possibility of rejecting him. He put it in the words of, it will be on the last day, perhaps, that we either say to God, your will be done, or God says to us, your will be done. And C.S. Lewis provocatively put this in terms of perhaps the door to hell is locked from the inside. And I think there's a real realism there that I think chafes with our modern understanding of actually that the human heart, why would we not want that? Well, who would want hell? I think that that's actually something that as a Christian I can say, even though I believe in God, there's even still a part of me that still willfully rebels against him. There's a part of me that wants my own autonomy. And I think that actually, if we're honest, there's a part of us, of all of us, that wants that. And it's not that far-fetched to say, well, if I didn't want that in this life, then if God really wants love with me, what? I think when we say, oh, if only after death God can say, oh, now I see you, now I can believe. We want God, what do we want? We want full freedom, we want God to be understanding, we want to be completely forgiven, we want him to understand. And I think, I look at those things and I say, this is what the Christian faith offers now. And I think that that's where Lewis, in this beautiful story, Great Divorce, suggests that actually it's really the outplaying of our own decisions and our own loves that I don't think God forces our hand. I think true love must be chosen. But I think the Christian understanding of hell, because it's relational, I think resonates, with the aspirations we have for justice and love in a really compelling way, I think. But that's a really heavy question. And I would say also, just as the last bit, I wouldn't say as a Christian, I know who goes to heaven and hell. It seems that even from Jesus' own words, that there are going to be some surprises. And I think that means I don't want to say to anyone, I think you're for sure going to, we have no idea. It's spoken of that Jesus knows our hearts. But I think that what he's really looking for is relationship, and it's relationship that we need to have the freedom to say yes to or no to. And I think that's what's on offer. But I think that God is just and fair, and I take confidence in that. And I know he's just and fair and good from the cross. Because he was good then, when it cost him everything, and he did that for us. I know that in all other situations that's really his character there that will be at play, even if I don't understand exactly how.
Super. All right. Actually, so that's it for questions from the audience, but if we have time, I'd like to ask one, if I can articulate it. So you talk about exclusive truth, and we each come with our own exclusive truth, because truth by necessity is sort of exclusive. How would we approach each other in love, and especially when we're faced with, say, a friend who disagrees with us, who has a different religious belief, and it's clearly very valuable to them, it's very important to them, and yet each person thinks that the other is wrong. So how do we navigate that without just setting the religious issue aside?
Setting the religious issue aside, in a sense, to say, well, we both disagree, so we're not going to talk about this.
Right, because often it's, okay, well, I think this and you think that, so we're just not going to talk about it, because when we talk about it, it often involves an argument that gets into sort of who's right and who's wrong, and it often gets very heated. And how do we approach that from a position of love without letting go of truth?
That's a great question. Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that I remember one of the earliest and worst conversations I've had about faith was in 4th grade. I was dating a girl, right, 9 years old. It's the dating life right there. And she wasn't a Christian. I'd grown up in church. The little I knew by that point was that, God's real and there's heaven and hell, and I just very bluntly put it that way, and that ended the conversation. And I think that what was reflected there, I think, was just a lack of compassion for that other person. And I think that this is where I know I'm guilty of this, and Christians are guilty of this as well. And I think that actually we can do this moralistically. We can say, I'm a Christian, therefore I know that I need to persuade you of this. But I think when we set aside the question of religion and think about just a friend, let's say, we all have problems like this. Say a friend who's really wrestling with, with an addiction or a hard situation at home, or a rough relationship that you sort of have a sense that, this is probably not the best for you to be in that relationship with that person who really doesn't care for you, and I can see that. But I think when it's something delicate like that and personal, as religion always is, these are our most important convictions about meaning in life and that sort of thing. I think when we approach it in that context and think about, actually, what I'm caring about is not being right so much as I care about you. I care about your holistic well-being. I think that would mean that the way I have a conversation with someone is really making sure that they know, first and foremost, that I am for them. I'm for them. And I think that that's not just something that even we can say. I think it needs to be demonstrated with a life of real commitment. I'm here for you, whether you agree with me or not. I'm here for you. I'm in the thick and thin. I'm here for you, even though you think I'm ridiculous. But I think that any true friendship from the other side, I think, should allow space for both sides to share their convictions with one another. That if I have a friend and I really care about them and they are deeply passionate about cooking, I should patiently listen to them talk about cooking or go along to cook with them. If I really care about them, if they're deeply passionate about social justice and I really want to be close to that person, I probably need to take part in that person's life in that way. So I think that, in a sense, friendship, I think, naturally, in a genuine way, should get to some of these deeper questions. But I think it's a sign that something's gone wrong when it becomes argumentative. I think then suddenly I want to be quick to ask, well, may I ask, have I said something that's really hurt you? And I think that could come from someone's personal experience of being really hurt by Christians who weren't caring. I think that there is also perhaps a time where it's not appropriate to have that kind of conversation. Let's say that, there are times in our lives when like a relative passes away or something like that, and sometimes there's openness in those moments to thinking about spiritual things, but sometimes I think as Christians, I think we can be so rushed, and I think that we can fear sometimes that if that Christianity is true or false based on our words in that particular moment, and you need to convey that, whereas I think the reality is, I think that there's a larger drama in Scripture. Jesus is speaking of seek and you will find me. Often, most people have a journey of sort of working out what they really believe. And I think that there's a way we can do that, walk alongside people and really see it in that sense of really, I care about you. And I'm wondering, I obviously think that this is a beautiful thing that's really true and real. But I want to know where you're at. Tell me, what do you believe about God and faith? And can I engage in that conversation in a way that's loving and reflective and respectful? And I think that we can, and not at the same time compromise the truth that we really believe. So I think that it's complicated, but I think that the tone of how it's being received is a good indication of, I often would just even ask, if someone's frustrated me in this sort of event, sometimes someone get really angry and I'd say, may I ask, what do you think I'm saying? And let me just clarify if the misunderstandings that it seems that you have. I think that there's space for that as well. So I hope that's helpful. It's a tough, tricky question.
Yeah, excellent. We did get one more come in from the audience.
Okay.
So, and actually I've encountered this sort of question a lot as well.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of common to our sort of cultural ethos. In the Christian belief, God demands perfection, and we all fall short of it. If God knows we cannot achieve his standard and that not all people will accept his grace offered through Christ, is he being intolerant in expecting it?
We can't achieve a standard. Could you read the last part of the question again?
If God knows we cannot achieve his standard and that not all people will accept his grace offered through Christ, is he being intolerant in expecting it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think a lot of people have this question. I think a lot of Christians have this question. And I think I would say what we find in Scripture is that you have in a lot of the Old Testament prophetical writings. You have prophets who are calling out for the people of Israel to turn away from the other gods that they've worshipped or the practices they've done that are against God's law. And I think often the Israelites still don't really change. And yet I think what's presumed there in even the moral commandments of Scripture or the calls of the prophets for the Israelite people to repent is a presumption that we have the ability to choose what's right in a real sense. And Christians have slightly different positions on the amount of our free will or not that we have. I would say what we see is very clearly both. It's presumed in Scripture that we have an ability to do the good, and yet we don't. In a sense, we can't, but in our not being able to live up to that, there still is culpability on our part. But having said that, I would want to underscore that, again, for the Christian faith, it does not come down to living up to a standard. I think that this is where what the cross offers, which I would say is, again, from my understanding of heaven and hell, which I think is the scriptural one, that says, actually, this isn't just if only I had heard that one piece of evidence, or if only someone had explained the gospel a little more clearly to me, then I would have responded differently. Actually, what we see from Scripture is that God is fair, and that what he offers to us is relationship. And he offers that in a way that that speaks to each of our hearts, and I think we don't quite know how that works out for every single human being. And I think that it really is God looking at our hearts and asking, what do we make of him? Maybe you might even say, well, I need the evidence. And I would say, well, I think that what God is looking for is a disposition of the heart that says, God, if you're there, and this is called the skeptic's or the atheist's prayer, God, if you're there, reveal yourself to me. I think what God is looking for is a disposition of the heart that says, if you're there, God, I know that I haven't lived up to your standards. And in a sense, I carry a degree of culpability, certainly. And I depend on your gracious acceptance of me anyway. That's what grace is unmerited favor. And I think that is what's offered in the Christian faith. And it's offered to every single person. And I think that God, in his fairness, extends that to each of us. And it's really on the grounds of our own desires and our own heart that the real decisions about eternity, I think, end up playing out. So that's how I would answer that question. It's a deep question. Again, with all these, I'd love to speak afterwards. But I think I hope that's a helpful way of thinking about it.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.